So it's time to move into the last session for the day. From all heart and soul and emotion and history and all of that, we're going to swing. The pendulum is going to swing to the other end now. We're going to talk about data. Yeah, so we're going to take a look at real hard data and see how that can be used, misused. Yeah, so all things are possible with data. Mining real data, navigating convenient untruths is going to take us into some of the gray areas, into some of the dubious areas, into some of the really troublesome areas related to data. So data is not just all fancy and hunky-dory, but let's look at the other side of data in this upcoming session. And for this, I welcome on screen Deblina Majumdar. Deblina, can you please come on screen? Yes, there you are. Hi.
Thank you.
Hi, Deblina. Welcome to the fest. It's a pleasure having you. So Deblina Majumdar has been working for the last 20 years in the fields of strategy, finance, and data science in companies such as GE, Fidelity, JP Morgan, and Prudential, all marquee names. She's the co-founder of Kahania, through which she helps simplify strategy using data storytelling. She contributes data-driven analytical articles to Economic Times Prime. Her first published book was a crime novel called A Marketplace for Murder, about murder set in the age of fragile digital identities. Her last book, or the latest book, is Sabu. I won't say last book, many more to come, I'm sure. So the latest book is Sabu, the story of India's first actor in Hollywood. Both these books are slated for digital adaptations, so congrats for that, Deblina. Huge congrats. She's writing more books and digital adaptations on topics involving finance, history, and crime, two of which are expected to release later this year. Absolutely happy having you here. Thank you so much for agreeing to anchor this conversation, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ganesh, and thank you, Benedict, and real honor to be here. I hope everybody can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much. So while we are going to navigate the convenient untruths, we're also going to talk about how data navigates inconvenient truths. And from hard data to the heart of data is what we will try to cover in this discussion. So just to introduce a little bit, long time back, Aristotle, very wise man, had said something really wise. It talked about the three keys of persuasion: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos was credibility, pathos was the emotional connect, and logos was the logic. So now when I think back, and particularly in the context of this session, what I feel is persuasion is even more important today. And using data should actually help us cross the bridge when it comes to persuasion, but what really makes it real? To answer that question, we have two fascinating panelists in this discussion today, and I'm very proud to invite Rukmini S. She's a data journalist, very well-known data journalist, having written for premier publications. She's also the author of a fascinating book called Whole Numbers and Half Truths: What Data Can and Cannot Tell Us About Modern India. Welcome, Rukmini.
Thanks very much for having me, Deblina.
Thank you. And we are joined by Govindraj Ethiraj. Many of us would have heard of him. Many of us would have read the articles. He's a journalist and he's a founder of the stupendous website called India Spent. Welcome, Govindraj.
Thank you, Deblina.
Right. So, what's been fascinating for me as we set up this panel and thought about this discussion is that both of you, Rukmini and Govindraj, you've actually looked at data at a pan-India level and looked at it for issues which can really drive both behavioral change as well as policy change. And I'm sure that is not an easy journey. So today we're going to dig a little bit more into what makes it happen and what can make it really click. So Rukmini, let me start with you. In your book, you've kind of intricately woven this relationship between data and inconvenient truths. And let me just take one example. I love this chapter which you had on employment. I loved all the chapters. But on this chapter, you actually said something around the real problem around unemployment is not about lack of just jobs, but also about suppressed data. So maybe if you could please share, Rukmini, how one of these influences and overlaps into the other, and I think more about your experience through data journalism and through navigating inconvenient truths.
Thanks very much, Deblina, and that's a great question. I think employment and data around labor is not something that's picked up often enough, and it's an exciting area to talk about. I think one of the things that happened, say, 3 years ago, is that there was a sort of sense, and I'd say maybe even a narrative created, that the real issue around employment in India was not so much that there is unemployment or a lack of data, but that data was doing a poor job of capturing new India and new India's new jobs. I think this was a sort of, very purposefully created narrative, and in a sense, it what this narrative did is it made people like us, all three of us here, who look at data, take a real hard look at what data can really tell us about labor in India and whether this narrative was based in fact or not. And in a sense, some of these numbers bring me to one of the central points that I do try to make in the book, which is that sometimes in our skepticism around numbers, I find that people, particularly younger people, have a sense that there is no good data at all in India. And in some ways, perhaps it's something of a failing on the part of even journalists if we've gone so far in terms of skepticism to almost create cynicism among people that there isn't good data. So, one of the points I do try to make around data around employment is that there is some good data. Our national statistical architecture that has its roots in India's founding movement really can tell us very vital truths about the way jobs work in India, truths that our own bubbles and our front pages would never normally tell us. But yes, let's also accept that there are problems with the data. Some of it is that our architecture has just not kept up to date with some of the changes that are needed, which is not to say that it doesn't cover jobs, your Ola, Uber. They are very much covered within boring old national statistics. But there is also a question of data not coming fast enough. And one of the things that happened in 2019 was very much it ties in very well with the topic of our conversation today, because it was a case of inconvenient truths and data shining a light where the government at the time and the government at the moment did not want a light shine on that at the time. So the official numbers that came out clearly showed a 45-year high in unemployment at the time. And what the government did was essentially to say that there was a problem with the numbers and just sit on them for as long as it took to get an election out of the way. Then the numbers were released, and they did essentially say what news reporting had shown. So, in general, I think that there's sometimes an overemphasis on lying and manipulation. I don't think that's the biggest problem with Indian data. I don't think outright manipulation is a big problem. But when you do things like this, when there is a very active suppression of data, then it builds into the sort of cynicism around numbers that people like all of us here are trying to push back against. So that's real damage.
Agree completely. I think that's real damage, and like you mentioned, Rukmini, the road from data to actually the narrative, and how people probably have a hypothesis and they are hell bent on proving that hypothesis. And we all know, you torture data enough, it confesses. So that kind of, plays probably an even bigger role than the lack of good or appropriate data. So with that, Govind, I think I just wanted to kind of drill into some of the work you've been doing at India Spend, where you're building narratives from ground up. A lot of the research is done ground up, and then you're using data to build narratives. So would just love to hear your journey lessons, Govindraj, as you build India Spend and develop this. And particularly maybe one topic I wanted to highlight, one article I found in India Spend, and I hope many people read it. This was not the usual trope around why the world should look at organic farming. This actually was about Punjab and why the move from chemical farming is actually very difficult, and there was a complete data driven narrative around it, which I found very interesting. So maybe, if you can share your overall journey and learnings, Govindraj, and also how your journalists can identify and work on such data driven narratives, and what's the kind of feedback you actually get when you're also trying to shape inconvenient truths through these data driven narratives.
Deblina, thank you very much. Thank you to the Bangalore Literature Fest for inviting me and all the organizers as well. So, we are more than 10 years old now. So we've been doing this for about 10 years. And in that 10 years, we've gone through different kinds of phases and settled down to one phase or either today, which may or may not change again. So in the beginning, we used to only look at data because that was also driven by our lack of resources to do anything else. So we would look at government data. And at any point of time then and now, I think there's far more government data, whether it's federal or state-wise, than people like us have the time or the ability to analyze. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So while you may look for a particular thing, Rukmini mentioned unemployment, which you may not find or you may not be happy with it. But the fact is, in general, there is a lot of data going around. And maybe there's not enough processing capacity either within the journalism fraternity or the research fraternity and so on. So that's one point. The second is, I think, as we've learned and continue to learn, it's important to tell stories with data. So even our tagline in a way is that we use data to tell stories in public interest in areas like health, education, environment, and gender primarily, and occasionally in agriculture and a few areas like you referred to. uh, I think our journey in a way is mixed. I think at one level it reflects the fact that many people are more comfortable with data than they were earlier. Second is that there are more questions about data that are being asked, and that can go both ways, because people, at some point can start disbelieving the data and be more convinced about a narrative that might be going into that data point. And I think that there was an example used just now as well. But overall, I would say that I think there is a spread of using data in general, but equally I think there is because there is so much of, I mean, some data, usage of data, people are also asking questions about other kinds of data which may or may not be available. So I'll give you one or two examples which in a way, and I there is one example that I use very often because it came very early in our journey, and it also defined how we form opinions or biases. And sometimes data does not change that, and that's also an equally important lesson. So let's go back to 2012-13, when there was a famous or infamous rape in Delhi. And there was
Yeah.
the big narrative that built up was that Delhi was the rape capital of India. And when we looked at NCRB data at that time, which many people were not looking in at that time, we found that Delhi, in terms of reported rape cases, was not the number one city in the country. It was actually number three. And there was one city from MP, or I think two cities from MP, which were actually ahead. Now, if you were to obviously dive deeper into that, many more questions come up, right? So, how many rapes or crimes against women are actually being reported? And maybe Delhi reflects the fact that they're not being reported, unlike, let's say, another state that reflects the fact that they are being reported. So that's one kind of question. The other question, I think, which became quite apparent even to, both data and other social commentators, was that what is the nature of crime against women in this country? So one of the reactions, the public reactions when that happened, and this happens every time, by the way, is that, okay, we need to step up policing, we need to have better quality, we need to have more women in police stations, we need to have round the clock patrolling, and so on. Very physical response to the problem. Now, there's nothing wrong in that. That's a good ask. And if you have the resources, surely you should have better better distribution of gender in police stations, and better patrolling and so on. But the thing is that, as data showed then and continues to show today, about 93 to 95% of cases of crimes against women, the victims are known to the perpetrators. And therefore, so this is not so much of a physical patrolling problem as it is a social problem. Now, which comes to the next question, which is that, are we willing to accept that this is the nature of the social problem? And then if so, what are we doing about it? So it actually moves from, let's say, a Ministry of Home Affairs to someone else, maybe Ministry of Child and Welfare Development, maybe something even more macro. So this gives you an insight into how data can start the process of going down a path, which then leads you to many more paths, all of which you should be willing to walk through with an open mind and eyes, so to accept everything and then build an hypothesis or a public policy reaction, which is what we are talking about in this case. Let me give you another example again, because we worked a lot and it became sort of well known. Was when we ran an air quality monitoring project in 16-17. And what we did was, one of the things it was very obvious then, was that people internationally, journalists were writing about poor air quality in Delhi, but there was no real data to measure it, except for one monitoring station which sat upon a US consulate in Chanakyapuri in Delhi, and one or two other boxes. So what we did was, we actually, thanks to a colleague who joined us, who was an IoT engineer, we actually built our own monitoring device. Thanks to the fact that sensors were available at very low cost, and we put a GSM machine into it, and we distributed it all over Delhi, and then subsequently also in other parts of the country. But most of our devices were in Delhi, essentially setting in friends' balconies so that it was protected from rain and so on. And we started measuring particulate matter 2.5 and 10. What we did then was we beamed that image over the cloud onto a live map. So for the first time in this country, you could actually see real time air quality in different places. Then we tied up with Twitter. So what you could do is you could say hashtag breathe Vasant Vihar, space Vasant Vihar, and Twitter, by working with us on the back end with another intermediary partner, would pull that data from that particular box and then send it to you back as a screenshot on Twitter. And you could see. So you would see that Vasant Vihar at this point is 210 on AQI. So one of the things that happened was, and it showed to us that data, when presented as cold, offline, in long Excel sheets, is not going to be consumed by anyone. And on the other hand, if you make it live, real time, and something that you can play around with, chances are much better. Air quality is something that we all obviously feel. So the cell was not so much, and there were other governments, both state and central, and the center, who were working on it at that point of time. So it kind of became a bigger and bigger issue. So much so that today air quality is what I would call a page one data point, along with your, let's say, temperature and so on and so forth. So at least now. Has enough been done to fix air quality? I think some has definitely been done, partly because of the public outcry that followed. That sort of not followed, but happened also that 16-17 period. And equally, the fact that now everyone could measure air quality. When you buy let's say, 10,000 rupees air purifier, usually it comes with an embedded air quality monitoring device. So you can see, how the system is changing. So that's one kind. That's another example of using data where, let's say, people at large who are affected can see it, and like I said, we made it interactive and so on. So therefore, a lot of people participate. If I fast forward to today, the example that I would quote, that I'd like to quote, is something that we've just launched called Chasing Methane. So now methane is the second largest greenhouse gas component after carbon dioxide. Most people don't know that. Methane emissions happen organically through agriculture, but they also happen through industrial emissions and so on. So we've set up something called methane.indiaspend.org, where we are tracking methane emissions, and we are updating this using satellite data. But we're working with the same former colleague and partners to set up to have real-time transmission of data from monitoring stations. This is a little more sophisticated than the air quality, but it works well. So the idea is, again, here to create awareness. Now, methane, like I said, is not AQI. You don't feel it when you're breathing or talking like you could in Delhi in winter, or you will in Delhi in winter just after Diwali. But methane is something that's important. So therefore, here is another example of where we are trying to use data. This is obviously, like I said, a project that's just started out, where we're trying to communicate the importance of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change by making you see a map, making you see how things are changing, and also showing you real-time data where we can on in this case methane. So these are the kind of illustrations about how you could use data. But just to sum up, I would always say, sum up this part, I would say that this is a journey for us. At no point can we say that we have achieved ideal audience penetration. The challenge, and it's not because the audience is at fault. The problem is that we have to keep looking for ways to make data more communicative, simple, and something that connects with people in the deepest way. Where you look at something and you say, oh, this is what is either affecting my life or something that I'm really charged about. So that is where our journey is so far, and hopefully we'll go ahead.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing it in such rich detail, Govindraj. And in fact, in a lot of my work in data storytelling, this is exactly what we see, right? And data storytelling is nothing but data with soul, right? You're getting to the soul of data. And, there was this old statistics joke which actually said that a man died while trying to cross a river that was on an average 6 feet deep. So a lot of times, there's a data literacy issue as well, and there's also a data narration issue where we try to go overboard with too much data. I know it's not easy for people to actually understand, and data storytelling is one way, which can simplify it, and we can use creative techniques like real-time data, simplification of data, maybe interactive data to actually make that happen. So that's really, really interesting. Rukmini, I'll come back to you. And, since we're talking about inconvenient truths in this session and data, I just wanted to also understand from you some of the insights you shared actually were very hard to share. So maybe if you could also take us through one of the hardest insights which you had to share in the book. It could be on crime, it could be on, you spoke about marriage and even on caste. So if you could just give us one of the hardest insights and, how you kind of helped build that from data to narrative.
Thanks for that. I think the insights around marriage and caste are hardest for people to hear, though they weren't the
Yeah,
hardest for me to communicate. In fact, I almost feel that, and this is a sort of good reminder of why you need good editors on books, and writers frequently take wrong calls or would take wrong calls left to themselves. Is I really assumed that because I had been writing about this for so long, I assumed that these things about marriage and caste were so widely known that they would be of little interest to people. So it was also a lesson in humility to journalists like me to know that things that you feel you've been banging on about for 10 years may have have actually soaked into the minds of very few, and it's worth repeatedly making the broad point around marriage and caste being that marrying within caste endogamy is so deeply entrenched in India that our assumptions around change are actually a bubble effect. Many of us see this in our own bubbles and assume it to be more widely spread. But the truth is that young Indians essentially get married the way that their grandparents did, which is in a highly endogamous within caste arranged marriage fashion. Under 5%, maybe 4% of marriages were intercaste among people currently in their 90s, and it's a similar percentage now. So if that number seems incredible, it's probably a reminder of how tight your bubble is rather than how bad the statistics would be my argument. But I think the number that was hardest, or the sort of insight that was hardest to communicate, was around crime. And in a way it sort of springs off the point that Govind built,
yeah,
and like India's Pen and like Govind's team, I too in 2012-13 was trying to think of ways to tell a story that it was apparent was much bigger than what the NCRB numbers were telling us. And one of the sort of insights I had going into the NCRB numbers was that using police statistics or FIRs as a proxy for the actual prevalence of crime is always going to be a problem in India, because the police station is a site of societal interaction as much as anywhere else. It isn't a site of pure scientific number creation. So I did know from having been a field reporter that uh, uh, that considering the FIR to be the building block of police statistics, on the basis of which we all seem to be forming notions around women's safety, around the relative ability of states to keep women safe, around women's agency, around what laws should be, all of that seemed like a very sort of dangerous direction to be going in. So what I ended up doing was that I tried to look at court records, which, although imperfect, seemed like one step better than looking at police statistics alone. So I ended up looking at one full calendar year of cases involving sexual assault of women in Delhi's 7 district courts. And what I found was that over a third of cases that were fully tried actually involved consenting couples, often interreligious and intercaste, against whom charges of sexual assault and kidnapping had been filed by parents who were opposed to these relationships. So what that share of the numbers at least seemed to be pointing at was a criminalization of the expression of young love, in a sense, more than an expression, more than it being proxy for crime alone. I think it was hard to communicate for a couple of reasons. One is because, in a sense, it took you beyond the realm of what direct statistics seem to be saying. Secondly, I did want to be very careful to not allow this to be seen as shorthand for false cases. These aren't false cases filed by women trying to get men into trouble, which is a popular narrative among men's rights activists, but as they call themselves, men's rights activists. But it was a crime being, the charges were being filed against the men, but essentially it was the criminalization of this relationship that the numbers were reflecting. So that was a sort of delicate line to tread, to make it quite clear that a crime was being committed and recorded here. It just wasn't the one that the IPC code was talking about. So I think that was a particularly hard insight to convey. Though I have to say that I take worrying about implications only so far. I think beyond a point you have to. Uh, do your due diligence, and then let those numbers out into the world, and not sort of endlessly worry about them. So,
Correct, correct.
or at least I had the luxury of being able to do that. So I would say the crime one was the hardest to communicate, while the marriage and caste ones, and more than that, I think one of the insights in the book that I have realized has troubled people the most is around the broad range of beliefs of young people, as
Hmm.
evidenced from opinion polling, because most opinion polling systematically over the last several years, decades, has shown that younger people do not profess more quote unquote progressive views than older people, although that is an assumption about the broad sort of arc of history, that as countries get richer, more urbanized, more westernized, younger people will move towards more progressive values. We've seen from the numbers for a while that that's not happening. We shouldn't be surprised, even when we look at the world around us, that that's not the direction that's going in. So from an audience point of view, I think that was the hardest insight for most people to come to terms with.
Right, right. No, I think that's so fascinating because that's a true picture of how data, narrative, bias, and inconvenient truth, all of that kind of interact and overlap, right? Some of it is surprising to us as custodians of data, as investigators of data, and some of it is to the audience. So I think a similar question, Govindraj, I think coming to you. Maybe you could also, you spoke about the methane story, which is probably an example of this. But any story where your team and you found something very counterintuitive from data, and it could be inconvenient, it could even be probably potentially damaging to some groups. But what helped you tell that story?
So, we tell stories as a matter of course. We put out one story every day. We have two kinds of audiences. So, one is what I would call broadly public policy audiences. Also, a lot of institutions worldwide cite us now, academic institutions, and that's become a core constituency which we didn't know was there as such. And we also have publishing partners. So many of the online sites like Scroll, First Post, or newspapers like Business Standard and others publish our stories or republish our stories. So we have two kinds of audiences. So that's how it spreads. So the I can give you many examples. So let me go to some what I would call one or two timeless ones. So
Right.
one timeless one which we did, I think, for the first time in 2018 was on how many people eat vegetarian food in India. Right. So the perception is that majority of Indians are vegetarian, and only a few people. So this story actually, which appeared in May 2018, I think, and I'm sure people. One thing you have to remember that people in the public policy space know most of this already, but it's really the larger audience, which includes, I guess, people like us in media who don't maybe know. So at that time, we found that about 80% of Indian men and 70% of Indian women consume eggs, fish, chicken, or meat occasionally, if not weekly, by using, we looked at national health data, and this is 2018. Subsequently, there have been many studies like this which have broadly pointed to the same thing. So similarly, other studies we've done, I think, have been around the incidence of disease. For example, even something like chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, COPD, or lung problems. So basically, the whole shift from, let's say, uh, uh,
Communicable
disease that is
to,
transmitted.
yeah,
Sorry.
communicable
Yeah.
disease to the
Yeah,
lifestyle
communicable
disease.
to incommunicable, which I think has happened somewhat silently, at least in terms of the larger discussion. So we've run a lot of stories on that. I can't think of any particular one, but again, that's, I would say, is counterintuitive somewhat. You would have not thought that more people now, if you look at all of that together, obesity, diabetes, COPD, and so on, is leading to more, let's say, either people falling ill and or even dying, then maybe other things. Even in the case, as COVID showed us, I mean, the people who are more likely to be affected severely by COVID were people who already had many of these comorbidities or prior conditions. So this is another example, I would say, of intuitive and counterintuitive. I think similarly we've done around uh, marriage. I mean, which communities see more marriages in terms of let's say male to female male to female ratios. So I mean, I can get the data on that, but I find that there are two problems again. One is that people like us do these stories. Rukmini does these stories. People talk about it, but exactly 6 months later again people will ask the same question, and even today if you say that x number of people, I mean more Indians are vegetarian than non-vegetarian, and south has a surprisingly large amount of non-vegetarian population, people don't believe it. So in a way it goes back to, I think, that fundamental challenge, which maybe is where we started our discussion, which goes for all these data points. The bigger the data point, the more it's almost like it's less likely that people will believe and retain it, or sort of have it as a start point. So you have to go back and convince them all over again that this is what it's saying, and of course it can happen that people don't believe the data itself. So and then what do you do?
Correct, correct. I think that's a great segue into the question I wanted to ask next. And this could be for either of you or both of you. So we are talking about data, we're talking about bias, and we're talking about, people not believing data, especially when it's counterintuitive or, when it's surprising insight. So, Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he spoke about these two kinds of thinking, systems one and systems two, and how decision making is a combination of both data and gut. And last few years, a lot of work has been done on these areas of behavioral nudges and how that can influence or shift behavior. So it's not just about communicating something, it's also about using these nudges, which we subliminally react to, and that makes it easier to kind of move the needle of persuasion or to really help people kind of understand and explore the narratives you're trying to share. So just wanted to understand, have you seen this being explored, or have you explored this while you're shaping and building these narratives?
Yeah, so actually, one of the sort of, as Govind mentioned, there's a lot more data that we all now have access to, and that's being produced by governments. And I think that's important to make that point because it's sometimes not acknowledged that there is much more data now than there was before. I also think that sometimes it's not always apparent how much data driven decision making is going on within governments, both at the federal level, both at the union level as well as the state level. And that's something I've been surprised to see of late, which is to see what these insights from internal administrative data, how it is affecting small incremental changes that are being attempted within, say, government schemes or within the rollout. So those aren't the sort of psychological nudges in public behavior, but it is interesting to me to see the impact that it does have on small changes in schemes, for example. I think there have been a couple of attempts in terms of public policy to do this sort of nudge work. So I do remember that there was an attempt in Mumbai where there is a
Yes.
shocking number of people die in train accidents crossing the railway track. So I remember the civic administration tying up with an organization and attempting to use those insights to uh, catch attention at the very moment that it's needed. um, I don't know if we see enough of that. I don't know what we know about its effectiveness, about whether that moment of decision making is more important, or the root issues of not having just enough time to cross properly. I wouldn't be able to weigh in on what level of this sort of nudge is needed. And I will also I want to also bring in the issue of COVID data, because while this wasn't a question of driving changes in behavior, to me it stood out really as one of the unusual moments where reporting in a way was able to break out of the usual bubbles. And when I try and think about how it was that that was able to happen, or why it was that that happened. I think it comes down to one of the most valuable attributes of numbers and of data journalism, which is to be able to sort of confer personhood, validation, legitimacy to people through numbers. And while this is the very sort of fundamental of what numbers are supposed to do, they're supposed to count people. It doesn't always become that apparent that what these numbers are is an aggregation of people. But I think what happened with the COVID reporting was that there was a very wide sense across the country that large swathes of the population of loved ones across the country were being missed out by numbers. And what reporting was able to do was to be able to perhaps offer some validation to these feelings of people. So although typically I do think that along with all of the polarization that we're experiencing in our public discourse, we see this in the consumption of news, and that extends to data journalism as well, which is that it's hard to break past the usual bubbles and get people
Yeah.
who have opposing viewpoints to consume news from other news organizations. I think the COVID reporting was in a way able to do this because it came back to that sort of first principle of what numbers do, counting people.
Correct. Correct. Anything to add to that, Govindraj? And then we'll probably move to a couple of audience questions.
Yeah. No, I think Rukmini's covered that well. I mean, the example that I was going to say, and it also links to another point. The data comes very late. This 2011 census data is what we are still,
Looking at
working
now.
with slices and dices and so on. And many of those slices come quite late, or much later. I mean, and maybe for good reason because it takes time and so on. But I think clearly when clearly there is a innate demand for more real time, data or insights, I think including for policy response and policy making, I think it's important to respond faster. The example that the counterintuitive part, right? Child marriage. You would think that if you, school history books and so on, it's over and gone. And, the census data says that nearly 12 million Indian children were married before the age of 10 years. This is a story we did in 2016 based on
Yes.
2011 census data. But it was a slice that was just released, I think. And almost 84% of those 12 million are from the majority religion. So, and not something that would intuitively you would even believe, and you would actually maybe jump against that. So these are just another instance of where what might either not be visible or not apparent, but data could tell you something if you choose to accept or believe.
Correct. Completely agree. And we have two very interesting questions. Maybe we should take those questions. So one's Benedict is asking, this is for you, Govind. When writers complain that access to data in India is tough, so a good research-based book is tough, do you think they're just being lazy?
No, I think I think Rukmini has written a very good book, and
I think the
it's
answer
I
is
think it's
Rukmini.
sorry.
I'm saying the answer is Rukmini.
Yeah. So yeah, but I mean I think more people could write, and it could be very specific. I mean I think she's taken the horizontal. They could be vertical. Someone, and maybe she herself will go into health or climate and so on. And yeah, I mean I think it's just not enough people focusing on this. I mean, like I said, we've completed 10 years in this space, and we are still amongst the perhaps the only one who's dedicated to this for good or bad. And Rukmini is amongst the few independent journalists who's dedicated to this. So we would all think and hope that, because sometimes ecosystems, the concept of ecosystem is when there are many people, and then I mean, as you know, in business, you can't, if you're the only person doing something. It's tough. I mean, you want more people around you who are doing similar things. You have cohorts. You talk to people. You discuss. You bounce around ideas, and I've always been hoping that there more people pick up more things, more specific things, and then start asking the tough questions, if where they need to be asked. So I think we have a long way to go, and I don't think it's to do with lack of data that we've already talked about. I think it's just maybe interest. Maybe there is fear and apprehension. I've been a financial journalist, so looking at data per se is not difficult for me. I mean, and if I used to look at balance sheets and so on, for me to, let's say, look at something, though I would still confess that I'm not so good at, let's say, crunching as many of my younger colleagues are, because they come trained. as Rukmini is pretty good at crunching as well. So yeah, but I think that we need more. I mean, we need much more. We are a very, very big country.
If I
Any
could
thoughts
just
to add to that?
add to
Yeah.
that, yeah, I just wanted to also say that there is often, I mean, I talk about tired narratives. I would say another sort of tired narrative that sometimes newspaper editors and perhaps even book editors, though luckily not mine, uh, instinctively have is to assume that. Numbers will put off people, numbers will be boring, readers don't want numbers. And I think, the success of India spend and the sort of hunger that many of us often see among younger people and students for factual things, for credible information, for numbers as well, should encourage more people to write, certainly, but should also encourage editors to not instinctively respond by saying that if it's numbers, it's going to put off people. Find a way to humanize it. How are you going to catch the reader? Nobody's going to want to see numbers on front page. So I think there is that tired narrative as well, which if we could do away with that, then perhaps it could encourage more writers.
Correct, correct. And I definitely see that's changing with some of the best editors, but I think probably more needs to happen. And I think the ethos, pathos, logos trio, I think still is very much alive and kicking, is what we're saying. One more very interesting question has come from avid reader. So he's saying, how can anyone as an individual become data literate, and how do you seek out reliable sources for data? Could be either of
Should
you.
I go first?
Go
Yeah,
ahead,
I'm
Rukmini.
sure Govind will have thoughts too. But yeah, so I think there's been a real explosion of people working with data and working to make data open, widely accessible, and sort of transparent. So India Spend is a notable example of working with data as well as ground reporting. There are also organizations like Factly that are very much focused on making on data literacy, on making people familiar with what data exists out there. There are several volunteer driven efforts like an organization called Data Meet that has now grown significantly over the last 10 years, which is also dedicated to sort of open sharing of data. So these are all great resources for someone looking to make themselves more data literate. And I see this movement growing. This sort of Indian public spirited open data movement is certainly growing. Additionally, I would say that there is some responsibility on the side of journalists and others who work with data to build greater credibility. And one of the ways to do that is to make the data that goes behind the reporting freely available. We have to let people look at the numbers themselves to be able to make up their minds, in addition to the reporting we do. Now that we have tools like GitHub and other places where we should all be putting our data out in public or redirecting to the sources, I think that's on us. That way of building credibility, to convince people that we're not producing a cherry picked version of the numbers, that's on us.
Correct. And I think very important point, Rukmini, from what you mentioned is just because we're analyzing data, we may not have all the answers, but we can initiate a discussion. Sometimes it's about scenarios and giving people a space to actually discuss and come back, rather than giving a unilateral answer. See, this is data and this is the answer. That's also probably a hard journey that we need to take, as people who are dealing with data. Anything to add to that, Govindraj? I'm sure you would have your view on that. And a lot of what you do is actually shaping better data literacy.
Yeah, I mean, a slightly larger point. When we started, our larger sort of mission was to improve the quality of public discourse, and that's how we came to data. So I think we, as a society, I mean, it sounds very broad and boiling the ocean, but as children in schools or in colleges, I think we have to develop or focus on critical thinking. If you develop critical thinking, my sense is, or if you focus on it, you'll automatically come to data as a tool to understanding issues better and to, as I said, improving the quality of public discourse. How else do you argue a point convincingly? By using data. So I think that is the larger thing that we should focus on as educators, as a literature festival. We do something called India Fact Quiz, and you can go online and join it. It's called indiafactquiz.com. It's under India Spend, where we hold quizzes every week. And typically, we take the questions are derived from India Spend stories mostly, and they also test biases. and we usually sometimes we go college to college. We have anywhere between 100 to 500 people joining in. So and this tells us that people are interested,
Correct.
and but the challenge and the opportunity in a way is to make it interesting, and is to, like I said, is to focus on the larger challenge, or the larger maybe conundrum is that how do you make people, and or all of us, how do we become more critically
Thinkers.
oriented in our thinking, in our approach to issues, in our approach to discussions, and that way hopefully we go to the next level, at least, instead of saying, oh, I thought so and I think so and maybe so. And
Correct, correct. No, thank you so much. I think that brings us to the end of our time. This has been fascinating discussion, Rukmini and Govindraj. And I think it was Edward Deming who was supposed to have said, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." But I think, as we know now, with listening, with the after listening to you, that we must not just bring data. We must weave narratives. We must tell compelling stories, and we must be open to listening to biases, and even working with biases. Thank you so much. Back to you, Ganesh.
thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Rukmini, Govind, and Deblina, for a fascinating session, for a fascinating chat into the backstory of data and some of the troublesome and some of the hidden nuances that people wouldn't have known of otherwise. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you at the fest.
Thank you.